Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, model railway enthusiast, and this is the second part of my video about landscaping a portion of my N-gauge, all-Japanese model railway. And last time I had laid all the groundwork, built all the structures for a pair of tunnels and the hills and a little terrace for tea plants and a complex of onsen hotels around this hot spring neighborhood. But everything had been left, everything was dried, but it had been left simply with a top coat of stain blocker paint. So from here on, we do the decorative stuff, which transforms it into something which I think is kind of special. In modeling this, as I said, I used to live in Yamanashi, and I'm thinking of places like Shosenkyo. So I was looking at some old pictures of Shosenkyo Gorge and the kind of stone that you see there and the kind of vegetation that you see there, so that I can create something that looks a little bit like that. Once the plaster cloth has dried and any paper mache has dried, I can start painting and developing a sense of exactly what everything is going to look like, with additions of trees and bushes and turf and so on. Painting rock is always a little tricky, and I find myself working in lots of different layers. I'm using simply very diluted acrylic paint, very basic, ordinary. I mean, this is children's paint, basically. But you can mix pretty much any color by combining them, keeping it pretty diluted, and then brushing it over in thin washes all over the rock until I start to get the kind of colors that I'm looking for. Now, as I said, I was modeling some of this on Shosenkyo, on specific photographs of specific areas. So some of the rock has a sort of ordinary kind of grayness, some of it is a sandier color, and some of it in areas especially associated with onsen, with hot springs, has a slightly yellowish cast because of the sulfur and other minerals in the water, which sort of impregnates everything. So I try a number of different versions of this until I'm happy with where the color is. As you can see, the color tends to lighten as the paint dries. And this is also an opportunity for me to supply a base color for my terraced area, which is going to be where my tea plants go. The ground itself won't be very visible under all the plants, so I just wanted to suggest a kind of dusty, sandy ground, which I can then add more color and texture to, particularly in the form of the little tea bushes themselves. Next, to add a little blacktop to my roadway to lift it above the overall texture of the surrounding rock and vegetation. I added a few fragments of plaster to my stream bed to create the impressions of little rocks and boulders that will be features within the onsen stream. Likewise, the water itself, I did this a number of times. My first attempt came out, it was too blue. I wasn't happy with it. It looked fake. So I kind of redid it and went for a lighter color to suggest relatively shallow pools and streams of water, which I then went over with a polyurethane gloss. There are, of course, other more complicated ways of doing water in model railways in using resins and things like that. But I didn't really think it was worth it for this particular thing. The advantage of resin is that you get a very, very clear look to the water, and it suggests depth, but I'm not actually trying to do that here. I didn't want it to look particularly deep. And the advantage of water is that it's absolutely smooth and flat. Again, because this is a sort of a narrow, winding, rocky spring course with little pools, I didn't think that the resin would particularly give me an advantage. Modeling water is always hard with on model trains because often, and you see photographs of fantastically realized waterfalls that look like a photograph of a waterfall, and they're great looking. The problem, of course, is that they look great in photographs because a photograph makes everything still. But the whole point of a model railway is that some parts of your layout are moving, the trains. If the trains are moving around and the water isn't, and it looks like it should be, then to me, there's a kind of, your brain has to do some sort of logical shifting in order to recognize that the waterfall is static, but the trains around are moving. So I would rather not try to represent moving water where I can. So in this case, we're dealing with very, very thin streams and little pools, and I'm quite happy with just a polyurethane gloss over a little color. And again, I'm trying to to make that color look a little unusual. It's got that milky color to it, which is because the onsen water has all those mineral salts in it. Most of the gluing that I'm doing in this video, I'm using a basic wood glue. In this case, it's made by Gorilla Glue, but it's a wood glue. Sometimes I'm using white glue like Elmer's school glue, something like that, which is not as strong, but is easy to use and cheap. The next step is to start adding turf materials to the painted surface to create a sense of texture. You can buy turf from companies like Woodland Scenics. It can get a little pricey. You can pay $15–20 for a single container bottle of the turf stuff that you're going to sprinkle on. I've found that I can get good results by making it myself out of sawdust. I work a lot in the workshop and I collect a lot of sawdust. And you can mix your own color refinements simply by mixing acrylic paint with water. And once you've got the color roughly the way you want it, just add the sawdust and mix it thoroughly until the sawdust absorbs all the paint, and then let it dry. It can take a few days, but then you've got usable turf that you can add both as a ground texture and as materials to glue to tree branches and things like that. And it looks surprisingly good, and you can vary the color in any way you want. To apply the turf, I create a mixture of white glue and water, about 50-50. And I'll coat the ground that I'm going to sprinkle the stuff on a little. I like to use a syringe so I can sort of direct it. Then I sprinkle the turf on top of it. It'll absorb a lot of the wet glue, and then I'll do another sprinkle of glue over the top to help get that turf solid so that it lasts. I tried a number of different things to simulate the tea bushes, and I wasn't entirely happy with the results. First, I used kind of cotton balls that had been painted or dyed in paint and then positioned, but they looked too regular. This is one of the difficulties of modeling in very small scale, that things which actually look quite accurate look fake when you see them on a model train board. So what I finished up doing was using sort of little turf clumps to create the sense of bushes. And, you know, it's not absolutely perfect because in some ways they're not regular enough to suggest carefully pruned tea bushes, and I lose some of the effect of the terracing. If I was redoing this, I might go with something a little bit more formal, a little bit more regular. But the danger is that it just doesn't look real. They don't look like bushes if they are manicured perfectly in the way that the bushes actually are. But that's the way it came out, and I like the effect of the terracing. On the other side of that road, I'm also building a series of little rice fields. And again, as I said, if you spend any time in Japan, one of the things you see is everywhere you look out of train windows, there are rice fields. And the rice fields are frequently submerged because this is how rice is grown in Japan. And it makes use of the abundant water supply, but also again of terracing. You'll see rice fields of different levels and different stages of development, but they are almost always wet. It's very difficult in N scale to do really, really small plants. So there's no realistic way of creating little rice tufts in N scale. You have to remember N scale is 1 to 160. So 1 inch equals about 13 feet. So the representation of something that might only rise like a foot above the ground is virtually impossible. So what I'm trying to do here is suggest it by scattering a little green turf into a polyurethane painted over a dark green base so that it looks wet. You get just enough shine to suggest the wetness of the field, and you get a patterning of solids to suggest the rice plants coming up. It's not perfect, but I was quite I like the idea, and I was reasonably satisfied with the way that it came out. So what I'm using here is simply pieces of cardboard layered on top of each other to create rising levels as we move up into the hillside. I've deliberately painted them in slightly different colors so that they look like they're in slightly different stages of development. And I've added a tiny perimeter wall, a couple of millimeters high, all the way around each field, and added a single walkway across the center so that it suggests that they're accessible. When that has had a chance to dry, I add the polyurethane, again using a syringe or dropper so that I don't dislodge the turf that I've already fastened in place, and it gives the whole a nice sheen that makes it look wet. I added a little more pale color to my watercourse and another coat of polyurethane to that to pick up the shine, and then dry brush a little pale, almost white paint over my rock to help draw out some of that surface texture. I made a couple of very simple tunnel mouths out of cardboard, which I layer and paint. I may replace those later on with something more ornate, but they'll do for now. I'm using a set of conifers that I bought online that were very cheap, and those will be the kind of trees that dominate the high elevations. You tend to get deciduous trees lower down and pine trees and such higher up. So at the top, I'm putting in a lot of pine trees, a lot of firs of different size, but I'll scatter them throughout the village, but particularly along that ridge line at the top. Now, initially, I wasn't happy with the look of the trees because the area that I have to work with is comparatively small, so it looked like they were in a line. So then they start to look unnatural. So in order to fill that out, and then I added more trees so that there's less space between trees, and they start to look fuller and more natural, and not simply a line across the top end, but they spread all the way down. And I'm using standard armatures that you twist. Again, these are cheap, easy to buy, and then you glue little clumps of foliage materials and such to them. You can do it in different colors to create variety and spread them out throughout the layout. Some of these I'm gluing in place on little stands. Some of them I'm simply pushing through the paper mache or the plaster cloth and gluing them in place. Also, occasionally I'll do a little hairspray to help hold things in place. The road obviously doesn't look particularly interesting at this stage, but I wanted to make it look a little bit more like a road, and one of the ways to do that, of course, is to add barriers. Again, in N scale, this is very, very tricky. You can buy these things, but again, this stuff gets expensive. Plus, when you already have a road in place, buying stuff that will fit it perfectly usually means you have to buy a lot more than you want and then cut it to shape. So I figured what I would do is make my own. In this case, I'm using some of those twist ties. I don't even know what you call it. You can buy spools of this stuff. It's used, you can use it for plants, you use it for various, for gardening supplies and other things. It's a wire with a little plastic on the outside. This is going to be my barrier. So I sprayed it silver and then used small nails as the upright posts to fasten it to. Knocking the nails in is not the easiest thing in the world, depending on what the materials are underneath the board. Obviously, where it's just cardboard or plaster cloth, you can push them through easily and hold them in place with a little glue. Where you've got wood, you actually have to hammer them in, which is a little traumatic. But they work. They're probably a little bit larger than I would really like, but they are at least structurally sound. And in some cases, because there was a lot of material, a lot of dense wood underneath, I cut the nails short so that I didn't have to drive them in too far. Once the upright posts are in place, you can lay the actual road barrier and fasten it to them. I considered soldering it if I was using like just ordinary wire, but in the end I just decided to glue it. Though that proved a little tricky. I had to use a number of different kind of glues before I figured out what was going to work. The wood glue obviously wasn't going to work to fasten plastic to metal. The white glue, also useless. Super glue was not giving me a strong enough bond at all, and was very difficult to work with. And in the end, I settled on a plumber's goop. It's a transparent, plasticky adhesive which gets tacky and very quickly and goes hard quite quickly and dries transparent. You can always touch it up with paint after the fact. So once all the barrier has been put in place, you can touch it up with a little more paint so that it looks better. And you know, that I was quite pleased with that. Having done the barriers, I then decided that I also, in creating the route of my roadway, I decided I'm going to want to put a small platform in between the roadway there and the tunnel mouth. The idea is that this will serve the onsen village. But in order to do that, I then need a way for people to get from that platform up into the hills, other than the roadway which I've already created. It seems, again, in Japan you see a lot of pedestrian specific ways of accessing things, and often steps. There are a lot of steps in Japan. So I decided to make a staircase that would run up into the sort of, at least the lower level of my village complex, from which people could then follow a path into the rest and up to the rest of the buildings, and that staircase would come down to ground level where they could access the train. Modeling steps is not the easiest thing, again, in N-Gage because it's so small, but all I did was glue pieces of cardboard on top of each other to create the stairs in sections. It's fiddly and it's slow, but I was actually pretty happy with the way that it came out. And again, you can cover a multitude of sins with a little glue and paint after the fact. So once I got a series of miniature staircases, I was then able to put them in place, lay them out onto the contours of the rock face. And then the trick was to then add railings. These I did simply with wire, a reasonably thick wire that could be bent to shape to create handle rails for the stairs, and then again pushed into the plaster cloth or the paper mache and held in place with a dab of glue. And they actually came out pretty well, and gives an extra nice little detail. The buildings, I had already put little LED lights in. They tend to be fairly low intensity LEDs, so that I wasn't going to get really bright light that was going to either bleed through the building or show through all the windows at once, or otherwise look unnatural. And the windows on these buildings tend to be very small, so I'm not worried about interiors being visible, because these are traditional buildings, and that means the windows tend to be quite small. So just enough light to suggest life inside. Where the building platforms weren't completely level, once I got the buildings on them, I shimmed them with cardboard until they were, and then added a kind of spackle to the base, which creates that sense of them being raised up. Actually looks very Japanese, because you often see buildings in the mountains which seem to have been raised up on stone platforms, concrete and stone, same as you would on the basis of the foundations around castles. Now to add a few people dressed in their onsen yukata.
They're very small.
I used a dark ballast material laid in the same manner as the turf, with a little diluted white glue to create pathways around the streams so that people can move around the whole area freely. So this is what it looks like now. It's not flawless and it's not completely finished. There are parts of the plaster cloth where you can still see the cloth, where I'll continue to add bits of turf and vegetation and things like that. I may add road markings at some point. I may even add some kind of crossing, and that's about it. Overall, I'm happy. As I say, it's not completely finished and there are other things to do, but I'm pleased with the way that it looks, and it's a fun project, and it has a little more sort of cultural specificity that I think suits the layout. So that's it.
あなたのいない世界じゃどんな願いも叶わないから燃え盛る豪華の谷間が待ってようと守りたいのはあなた以外何にもいらない愛だ以外の問題は取るに立たないよくは望まない神様お願い愛変わり映えしない明日をください一日の終わりになる
That's all I'm going to say for now. As ever, please like, comment, subscribe. You can tell me what you think in the comments. Check out my Patreon page. As I always say, this channel is not monetized, so my patrons are the only reason that I'm able to keep doing this stuff, justify the time. Check out my books, of course, including my Japanese influenced books like Hideki Smith. Check out my little dashery store, and that's all. I will talk to you soon. Thanks very much. Bye.